The warring factions of the long-running Syrian war are about to meet in Geneva yet again. This time, President Putin thinks there's a real chance for a breakthrough to end the war. But is that just wishful thinking? And in Kenya, the president and his deputy have been sworn in for a second term after months of political uncertainty. Might this be a catalyst to revive economic growth in the country? I'm Dongshi, sitting in for Liu Shin today. Welcome to The Point. A new round of Syrian peace talks was due to start today in Geneva, but has now been delayed by a day after the Syrian government delegation protested the opposition delegation's demand that President Assad step down. The government delegation will be headed by Syria's UN ambassador and chief negotiator Bashar al-Jafari. For the first time, however, after talks in Riyadh last week, a unified 36-member Syrian opposition delegation is to attend the talks, though there have been conflicting reports of whether they will insist on Assad's removal or not. Also last week, leaders of Iran, Turkey, and Russia met in Sochi, where they supported a comprehensive dialogue on Syria. Vladimir Putin said that the meeting in Sochi would be a stimulus for the UN peace talks in Geneva, adding that there was a real chance to end Syria's war, which monitors say has killed more than 330,000 people. So how likely is a breakthrough now after so many rounds of peace talks have failed in the past? Joining me now from Geneva, Enmar Wakaf, founder and director of Ganasses. In Beirut, we have Sharma Inawani, a journalist covering Mideast geopolitics. And in Washington, D.C., Professor Doga Araup from the School of International Service at the American University. I'm so glad to be joined by all three of you today. Now, Syrian opposition parties from the Turkey-based coalition and mainstream Free Syrian Army factions, as well as independents, met in Riyadh last week to unify their position ahead of the UN-backed peace talks. Several rounds of UN talks in Geneva between the Damascus government and the opposition have made little, if any, progress at all since the Syria conflict erupted in 2011. My first question is to you, Mr. Wakaf. How unified now is the opposition? Do they still have their own agenda? And will their unity actually last?
Well, first of all, we need to look at their delegation or current delegation as one delegation rather than a unified delegation. They have agreed somehow to share enough interest points and demands and understandings to sit at the same table on the same side. However, they are not having the same arguments. They have their own differences. So each of whom they have their own agenda in a sense. It's not like a unified agenda with a one demand or whatever it is. There are reservations by certain parties on certain points, like for example the issue of President Assad leaving office as a precondition for any political transition.
Ms. Nawani, if they each still have their own agendas, their own differences, what does this unity, this new unity mean this time around? What will be different?
I don't think anything will be different. You know, this is the 8th round of Geneva talks, and every single time the opposition composition shifts. They represent the views of foreign governments. They represent the views of adversaries of the Syrian government, the U.S., the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and other countries. These are hand-picked delegations, and the groupings have been formed in countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and elsewhere. So this is part of the problem with the Geneva talks is that one of Staffan de Mistura's initial deliverables was a unified Syrian opposition to sit across the Syrian government to negotiate, but he's never been able to deliver that. And so even though they're talking about more unity and no preconditions, in fact, this Syrian opposition sitting across the table today is likely to change and more further in subsequent meetings.
I want to jump right in to the topic of Assad's fate. because, as we all know, this has been a sticking point in the previous rounds of negotiations, and already at the start of this round, it's delaying the Syrian government delegation's arrival to the talks. Professor Iraup, could there be any kind of leeway or flexibility for the opposition delegation this time when it comes to what happens to Assad?
Well, let's, I think, start looking at the picture from the perspective of the Assad government. So, Assad government thinks that they're winning the war, and so far with the Russian support and Iranian support, they've been winning the war. And for that reason, any suggestion by the opposition group that Assad steps down is a no-starter for them. So I think what we're going to see, maybe not in this round of talks, maybe in a ninth round of talks, I expect to see a new opposition formation that would be more willing to accept Assad stay in power for at least another 5 years or so.
You're right. The fact is they have been winning the war. The fact is they have been gaining the upper hand in the battlefield with the help of Russia, of course. With that in mind, is the Syrian government ready to make any type of concessions or compromises in order to move these talks forward? Let me come back to you, Mr. Wakaf.
Well, I don't think the Syrian government's position has changed much since January 2013, when President Assad, made a sort of initiative in which he said there would be like a national unity government, there would be some sort of a dialogue between Syrians, within a certain framework, a conference of some sort, which would then prepare for a new constitution, according to which there would be new elections and so on and so forth. This sort of framework hasn't really changed since. And even at the time, Syrian government wasn't feeling very strong, but it's just what can be really achieved in their eyes. We're on the same track now. The Syrian government is proposing, along with the Russian government, some sort of a conference in Sochi for the Syrian parties to sit with each other and talk, like intra-Syrian talks. These are not negotiations, they won't be negotiations, it's just about brainstorming, perhaps, developing certain ideas and agreeing on something. Now, they are now in a much stronger position than 2013, and there are multiple tracks that are taking place at the same moment, some of which, like the Astana process, is actually producing results on the ground. So the Syrian government now feels that they are in a position to start dictating matters, hence their delay. It's a clear message that, guys, if you don't get real, then what's the point in all these discussions? If you're going to repeat time and again that Assad must go and be unrealistic, so to speak, then why are we having this exercise? That's probably the message that the Syrian delegation and the Syrian government wanted to deliver today. So in a sense, this is how the Syrian government views this. There's going to be some sort of a transitional body, like a national unity government. There will be some sort of a conference in which Syrians will talk with each other, representatives of all sorts, develop ideas, and after which there would be a new constitution developed, and then some elections. And I think this is exactly where we're heading.
Ms. Narwani, you said not much will be different this time. I want to talk to you about the four main topics that will be under discussion: a new constitution, then governance, combating terrorism, and of course elections. Which of these topics will prove most problematic during the talks?
I think, for me, I think the issue of terrorism, frankly, I don't think it's going to be much discussed, because it's one of the big elephants in the room. Going back to what I was saying earlier, Staffan de Mistura was tasked 2 years ago with doing two things. But one was to create a Syrian opposition that would sit across the Syrian government at the negotiating table. And the other thing was to develop a list of terrorist groups in Syria. And this would help parties to the conflict know which militants they could target and bomb, and which militants would now be part of reconciliation or a negotiating process. He never delivered these lists, you know, and part of this problem is that the Geneva process is that it's forging ahead without this very critical component. How are you going to talk peace? How are you going to talk about transitioning new governments, a new constitution, you know, elections, etc., without resolving the elephant, you know, in the room, the terrorism issue, which is terrorists who are backed and supported by many of the 20 countries who oversee the Geneva process. So I think, I mean, there's some sense that because ISIS has been defeated largely, that we have arrived at a resolution there on that topic, but not at all. I mean, there are big pockets of militant groups in Syria that continue to pose a problem to the resolution of this conflict. And so I think the terrorism issue is one that needs to be addressed because it is one that can be meaningful to the discussion of what comes next in governance, as well as a resolution of the military situation on the ground. They need to be done concurrently.
Professor Eralb, what topic do you think will prove most challenging for the talks?
I think the most important topic that I suspect any of the parties in Geneva would be very willing really to discuss is the future autonomy for the Kurds. So Syrian Democratic Forces, which are obviously spearheaded by the PYD and its coalition across different ethnic groups in north of Syria, proved to be the most effective fighting force against ISIS. And with Russian support and later through American support, they actually secured a large chunk of territory from ISIS threat, which obviously also is threatening Turkey, who is quite wary of a growing political entity of another Kurdish political party, yet now this time in Syria. So without the parties addressing what kind of autonomous structures would be put into discussion in formation of a new constitution, I don't think we'll be able to see any form of political stability in Syria.
Professor Eralb, talking about American support, the U.S. has been conspicuously absent in the recent peace process, leaving Russia to make most of the running. And some would argue that America has no clear Middle East policy, and as a result, Iran, through its proxy Hezbollah, will end up controlling the entire Middle East, and not least posing a very real threat to Israel. How do you react to that scenario?
Well, Pentagon yesterday issued a statement responding to an earlier question that there now are 2,000 U.S. troops on the ground that play a support role in working with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and U.S. government did provide ammunition and other weaponry that some of them are actually quite advanced to support the SDF forces turning into an effective fighting force. So although we do not necessarily hear from the White House about having any official Syrian policy, American forces are on the ground, and I think they're going to be leveraging the Kurdish position vis-a-vis the Russians and Iranians in bringing Kurds to the table.
Mr. Wakaf, I want to end with you. We're running out of time. Stefan de Mistura, the UN peace-making negotiator, says he is optimistic, and Russian President Vladimir Putin says there's a real chance this time. I wonder what you think about this round of talks. Are you optimistic?
I don't think this round of talks will deliver much. I think there is pressure by the Syrian government and by the Russians. We heard today the permanent representative of Russia in the UN office in Geneva, Alexei Borodavkin, say that there is no added value in these talks and that he cannot really envisage any outcome when one party considers the other party to be totally criminals. On the face of it, on the face of it, we could probably say that Russia and Syria are trying to undermine the Geneva talks. But to be honest, we could also view it from a more constructive point of view, whereby Syria and Russia are trying really to put some pressure on the other party to come up with the goods, stop having all this negative rhetoric and be practical and more pragmatic about things. We've also heard the Americans and the American president and the French president say that Geneva is the only legitimate political process in Syria, so to speak. They want to stick to it. They are not happy with Russia calling
Mr. Wakaf, I'm sorry to cut you off. We are truly running out of time.
In this particular round, I don't think it's going to happen.
Founder and director of Ganassas, journalist Sharmai Nawani, and Professor Doga Araup from the American University in Washington, D.C. I want to thank all of you for your insight on this. You're watching The Point on CGTN. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Point. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy William Ruto were sworn in for a second term on Tuesday. Over 10,000 people attended the ceremony, along with 13 heads of state and lower-level representatives from countries including the U.S., the U.K., and China. The inauguration had been delayed for months by two disputed polls, a series of sometimes deadly street protests, and a historic court case. In early September, Kenya's Supreme Court annulled an August election result, citing irregularities and illegalities. The court ordered a rerun in October that was boycotted by the opposition, handing Kenyatta a landslide and 98% of votes cast by 38% of the electorate. Months of political uncertainty have badly affected the economy and divided the Kenyan people. Can Kenyatta bridge the divisions and revive economic growth? We are joined in our Beijing studio by Hannah Wanjir-Wider, who's a Kenyan living in China. She works as China representative of the China-Africa Advisory. Also with us, Professor He Wenping, a senior research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Ladies, welcome to The Point. Let me start with you, Ms. Ryder. Months of uncertainty in Kenya. What has it done to the country, and who was the worst hit?
Well, Kenyans are very business-like people. We get on with the day as we have to. And so even though, despite the uncertainty and despite the fact that there were many protests in different areas around the country, people actually just got on with what they had to do and just had to keep on going. But that said, of course, having this kind of uncertainty is no good for investment. It's no good for Kenya's international reputation and so on. So obviously sectors such as tourism and so on were badly hit, as is typical in these sorts of difficulties at these sorts of times. But I'm personally just pleased that the violence was not as bad as in 2007. Of course, every life lost is extremely sad and shouldn't happen at all, but the violence this time was not as bad as it was in 2007, and the measures that different companies and so on took were not as drastic as some were fearing were needed to be taken.
And so divisions among the people were part of the reason why there were so many protests and deadly violence. And President Kenyatta said that he will do his best to unify the country again now in his second term. How long do you think it will take to undo the damage, if that's possible at all?
Well, it's going to be, I think, quite long, because this time around the society has been divided into two parts. We see this is a very unprecedented, like Supreme Court, even turned down that first election results, and then those second round of election, and the opposition party has been boycotted. So that's why the second round presidential election has relatively lower the turnout. So which means now there's two parts. So one is the supporters to the opposition party, even though that death toll now is relatively lower than the 2007, but that doesn't mean now all the society now has been already very united. So it takes time for the President Kenyatta to reunite the country, reunite the people. But the thing he needs to do is, of course, like Hannah just said, to revive the economy first. Because when we trace back to the economic development in Kenya, we will see every time when the election year and the economic growth rate is dropped. It dropped very, very, very much. It's not just a little bit. So this time around, because 2 elections has been taken place just in 2 months, so those economic performance is even getting worse. So people suffered from those jobless. So they suffered like even the inflation rate. So the thing to let people feel happy again is to give them job. So from the giving job first, and then you can reunite them, I think, the second.
It's interesting that both of you mentioned the presidential election back in 2007, which was, of course, deadly, with over 1,000 people killed. I want to talk to you about, from a Kenyan people's point of view, do you feel that they are getting used to these presidential elections that come with deadly violence, that come with protests, that come with turmoil?
I think, well, as Kenyans, we are used to elections. Obviously, we had a leader who was in power for 24 years, and he stepped down at the time of the elections and paved the way for a more clearer process for elections, clearer political parties and so on. But it does take time, and what Mwai Kibaki began after Arap Moi stepped down, what Uhuru Kenyatta has been taking forward. Of course, there's a lot more work that can be done, but there has been improved growth in Kenya. There has been improved, you see it on the streets. More and more people are employed. Yes, we still have a very low employment rate, but our infrastructure is improving. We have this, new railways and so on, new highways. Our economy is improving. So that is the number one for most people. For most people, that is the number one. Although, yes, Kenyans do care about politics a lot. We spend a lot of time discussing it. We spend a lot of our time focusing on it. But fundamentally, if the economy improves, we will improve as a nation.
Kenyans care very much about politics, but Ms. Kha, do you think that they're disappointed that each and every presidential election has to go through such a turbulent period of time and with violence associated with these elections? What do you think is the reason behind all of that violence when it comes to elections in Kenya? We talked about, of course, divisions among the people, division among different tribes. Tell us more.
Yes, I think you rightly point out that the root causes for those, even before or between or after this election, chaos always goes on, not only in Kenya, in many other African countries, same thing happening. So we are always saying this is chaos, like always hand in hand with those elections. But I will not say election is the wrong thing, even though they have bring some chaos. So because the democracy is the thing that now the African countries now has been fighting for. They have achieved a lot of, I think, achievements. For example, this Supreme Court, I think this is one of the biggest achievements, because that shows this check and balance now is really in function, because those judges, they can make this decision with a very bold. I think it's very bold. They are not afraid of any revenge coming from any sitting president. So this is a very unique thing. But anyhow, because Africa's economic development is still in a relatively low level, so I think the modern those political means party, all those things has not so closely with those classes building. It still goes to those pre-industrial, those ethnic group. Because ethnic group based on the agricultural society. But only the classes is built from those industrialization. So because no matter you're coming from which ethnic group, once you are settled down in the city, working in the same factory, and then you belong to the same interest group. So that's the working class. And then you have your own party. So when that party competing, for the parliament seats, whatever, they will represent those working class interests rather than to represent which ethnic groups, their interests. So this is the fundamental reason why those African countries, whenever they have those elections, and then the social classes is still in the infancy, and then easily go back to those pre-industrial, those ethnic groups, those identity, so make things in chaos.
Those fundamental elements you've been talking about, they haven't changed much, and they possibly won't change in the near future. Are you also saying that we could see another repeat of this process when it comes to the next presidential election in Kenya?
But the things also moving forward. For example, in Kenya, I visited Kenya several times. Those civil society has been developed in a very rapid way. So they are serving as a very strong this guarantee. Even we can say it's how to say it's some keeper maybe for those democracy. So when all those things going wrong, those civil society will be mobilized. And also like check and balance, I mentioned, Supreme Court, like those administrative and court and the lawyer, all of those. So they are moving forward, even though I mentioned those social classes still in the infancy, but other democratic means, they are also developed. So those things can make up some the shortcomings they have.
All right, my last question comes to Ms. Ryder. You've written an article commenting that Kenya's ties with China will be a key metric in assessing their trajectory. How do you see China and Kenya's cooperation going forward in the future with Kenyatta's second term now in place?
Yes, well, Kenya is one of the Belt and Road countries. Kenyatta was part of the Belt and Road Forum. Kenya took part in that, and we have not yet attracted enough investment from China. So that will be one of our key areas for the Kenyan government to work on, but also a key area for the Chinese government to help Kenya with, providing incentives for companies to come over to Kenya to invest and that kind of, and so on. There's also the aspect of opening up the Chinese market to Kenyan products, for example. The Kenyan government's really keen to have to see if it can have a better market for its tea. Tea is one of our biggest export earner, even bigger than tourism, and which is quite surprising. But you speak to a Chinese person about Kenya, and they say, "Oh, Kenya's animals," but tea is our key product in the rest of the world.
All right.
Maybe we can bring it here.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ryder, Ms. He. I want to thank you both for your insight today. Thank you for coming in. And that's it for this edition of The Point on CGTN. I'm Zhong Shi. Thank you for your company.